Some aircraft earned loyalty the moment their engines turned over. Others carried a reputation that followed them across airfields like a warning. By the time he was assigned this one, the machine had already been spoken about in lowered voices, in briefing rooms, and beside maintenance trucks slick with hydraulic fluid. It sat at the far end of the dispersal area, its paint dulled by weather and exhaust, its fuselage marked by patches where sheet metal had been riveted over fatigue cracks. No one openly refused to fly it, but when new assignments were read aloud, a quiet stillness would settle over the group, as if everyone were measuring their luck against its serial number. The squadron operated from a temporary strip carved into farmland, churned to mud by transport vehicles and rain. Canvas tents sagged under damp wind, and the smell of aviation fuel mixed with wet earth. The war had moved faster than logistics could comfortably support. Replacement parts arrived late, sometimes mismatched. Engines were rebuilt from salvaged components. Aircraft that would once have been retired were pushed back into rotation because the tempo of operations demanded numbers in the air, regardless of condition. New offensives required persistent coverage, escorts for bombers flying deeper into hostile territory, and reconnaissance sweeps over terrain that bristled with anti-aircraft batteries. There was no margin for sentimentality about machinery. The aircraft assigned to him had begun its service 2 years earlier, when production lines were at their peak and materials were plentiful. Since then it had endured hard climbs, evasive dives, and hurried landings on improvised strips. The hydraulics had developed a tendency to lose pressure without warning, leaving flaps slow to respond and landing gear reluctant to lock. The engine, a liquid-cooled inline design built for sustained power at altitude, had a reputation for running hot, would never push beyond conservative settings. Mechanics could coax it into compliance, but only through constant adjustment, tightening fittings, flushing coolant lines, inspecting gaskets that had already been replaced twice before. He was not a veteran ace transferred in triumph. He had arrived as a replacement, posted after another pilot failed to return from escort duty the week before. His logbook showed competence rather than distinction. He understood procedure, respected fuel calculations, and avoided unnecessary risks. When the squadron commander handed him the assignment, there was no apology attached, only the practical acknowledgement that every aircraft must be flown and every mission must be covered. He nodded once, accepting the responsibility with the quiet restraint expected of men who knew complaints changed nothing. The ground crew watched him approach the aircraft for the first time. They had grown protective of it in an almost reluctant way. Machines that survived long, enough developed personalities in the minds of those who maintained them. They knew where its skin thinned near the wing root, and which hydraulic line required careful inspection before dawn sorties. One mechanic pointed out the newest patch along the fuselage, explaining that stress fractures had been sealed but would need monitoring. Another mentioned that the temperature gauge occasionally lagged behind actual engine heat, advising him to trust vibration through the control column more than the dial. Their tone carried neither alarm nor reassurance. It was the practical language of men who had learned to live with imperfection. He ran his hand along the leading edge of the wing, feeling unevenness beneath the paint. Up close, the aircraft bore scars that photographs would never show. The canopy frame had hairline scratches from hurried maintenance. The tires were worn at the edges from heavy landings. Inside the cockpit, the smell of oil lingered faintly, embedded in fabric and insulation. The instrument panel held the familiar layout of altimeter, manifold pressure gauge, tachometer, coolant temperature dial. Yet several markings had been repainted by hand after fading. The control stick moved with stiffness that suggested worn linkages, though it remained responsive enough under steady pressure. Training manuals described optimal climb rates and recommended engine limits, but those pages had been written for aircraft fresh from factories, not for airframes that had absorbed years of strain. He understood that survival would not depend on extracting maximum performance. It would depend on restraint, managing throttle settings carefully, allowing the engine to breathe rather than forcing it into sustained redline. It would require planning his turns wide enough to avoid sudden stress on the wings and anticipating descent early, so that flaps could deploy gradually if hydraulic pressure faltered. Discipline would replace confidence. The operational pressure surrounding the squadron intensified each day. Briefings detailed enemy interceptor patrol patterns and expansion of anti-aircraft positions along key transport corridors. Losses had mounted steadily. Photographs from reconnaissance flights showed craters where aircraft had fallen, dark scars against fields and forest edges. The commander emphasized cohesion and timing, reminding pilots that even flawed machines contributed to protective screen around bombers. Numbers in the air could deter attacks that a smaller formation might invite. On his first pre-dawn sortie with the aircraft, Frost coated the canopy, and ground crew warmed the engine carefully to avoid sudden temperature spikes. The starter coughed before the propeller caught, spinning into a steady rhythm that masked subtle irregularities only experienced ears detected. He listened closely, noting a faint vibration at idle that smoothed as throttle increased. Gauges rose gradually. Coolant temperature edged upward more quickly than ideal, but not yet dangerously. He signaled readiness and taxied across the uneven strip, feeling each rut to the landing gear. As the aircraft lifted from the ground, there was a brief, unmistakable heaviness in the climb, as if the machine hesitated before committing to the sky. He adjusted pitch slightly, easing the ascent rather than forcing it. The engine temperature crept higher during the initial climb, then stabilized once he leveled off. In that moment, he understood the balance he would have to maintain. The aircraft could fly. It simply demanded patience. Below him, the airfield shrank into a patchwork of tents and vehicles. Ahead lay contested territory, and the expectations of a squadron stretched thin. Behind him remained the quiet awareness among mechanics that survival would hinge not on the machine's design, but on the judgment of the man guiding it. The first weeks over hostile territory erased any lingering doubt about the aircraft's condition. What seemed manageable during training sorties became starkly evident once the machine carried full ammunition, external fuel tanks, and the weight of expectation that accompanied combat assignments. Climbing to operational altitude demanded near maximum power, and the engine responded with a strained, metallic growl that vibrated through the rudder pedals. The coolant temperature needle rose faster than it should have, inching toward the upper arc where caution blurred into danger. He learned to moderate the ascent, trading speed for preservation, even when formation leaders signaled for tighter cohesion. Altitude was life in aerial warfare, but for him it had to be gained without provoking the engine into revolt. Enemy territory revealed itself first through patterns, rail lines converging toward depots, convoys threading along narrow roads, factory roofs camouflaged beneath netting. Yet before those details came into focus, there was always the distant bloom of anti-aircraft fire. Black bursts appeared at bomber height, suspended briefly in the sky before dissolving into smoke. The sound arrived a moment later, dull concussions that reverberated through the fuselage. Air defenses had grown more disciplined since earlier campaigns. Gun crews no longer fired sporadically. They concentrated their salvos in calculated layers, forcing formations to either climb into thinner air or descend into the reach of smaller caliber weapons. The sky itself felt structured by invisible geometry. Within this tightening lattice of danger, the aircraft's vulnerabilities demanded constant attention. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated during abrupt maneuvers, causing the flaps to respond with a sluggish hesitation. He avoided unnecessary adjustments, keeping the wings clean and relying on gradual banking angles rather than sharp rolls. The engine, prone to overheating under sustained strain, required subtle throttle modulation. He watched manifold pressure and revolutions per minute as closely as he scanned for enemy fighters, easing back just enough to maintain integrity without sacrificing position. Every decision was measured against two threats, the adversary outside and the machinery beneath him. The squadron's tempo intensified as strategic bombing objectives expanded deeper inland. Briefings grew longer, maps more intricate, casualty lists heavier. Replacement pilots arrived with fresh uniforms and uncertain expressions, absorbing instructions about rendezvous points and radio frequencies. Those who returned from missions carried quieter faces. The necessity of persistence overrode caution. Commanders emphasized that pressure on industrial targets would shorten the war, even as aircraft failed to return at an unsettling rate. In that environment, mechanical hesitation could not become an excuse. The mission profile remained fixed regardless of individual limitations. He adapted by refining his awareness to a degree that bordered on instinct. Fuel consumption became a silent calculation running alongside every maneuver. External tanks were dropped at precisely the moment they no longer justified their drag, balancing extended range against vulnerability. He tracked the subtle tremor in the control column that preceded coolant surges, recognizing when airflow through the radiator required adjustment through minor pitch changes. During long transits, he shifted the mixture settings incrementally, squeezing efficiency from an engine that punished excess. Enemy interceptors exploited any weakness in formation integrity. Sleek silhouettes would emerge from sun glare, diving with kinetic advantage. In those moments, raw performance often decided survival for others. For him, it required anticipation. He avoided climbing contests that would force his engine into overheating. Instead, he maintained lateral spacing, preserving energy for defensive turns that relied on timing rather than thrust. When forced into evasive maneuvers, he favored descending arcs that allowed gravity to assist acceleration, reducing strain while maintaining maneuverability. The aircraft responded best when not coerced. System failures began to appear without ceremony. On one mission, hydraulic pressure dipped during a prolonged banking turn, causing a brief shudder in the wing. He leveled immediately, allowing pressure to rebuild before attempting further correction. On another, the temperature gauge flickered erratically, lagging behind actual engine heat. He trusted vibration instead, sensing through the airframe when combustion grew uneven. The cockpit became less a compartment of instruments and more an extension of his own perception. He listened to pitch changes in engine note, felt resistance in control surfaces, monitored the smell of oil for any sharp alteration. Weather compounded the strain. High-altitude cold thickened fluids and stiffened components already worn by years of service. During descents into warmer layers, sudden thermal shifts risked expanding metal too quickly. He moderated his rate of change, descending in stages rather than plunging abruptly. Clouds offer concealment, but concealed hazards as well. Icing that accumulated along wing edges, adding weight and disrupting airflow. De-icing systems functioned, though imperfectly. He engaged them sparingly, conscious electrical load, and hydraulic interplay. Despite these constraints, he found a rhythm that allowed him to contribute reliably to formation objectives. While others surged ahead during climbs, he maintained steady alignment, arriving seconds later but intact. In defensive engagements, he positioned himself where visibility extended across multiple arcs, compensating for mechanical hesitation with spatial awareness. Fellow pilots began to note that he returned consistently, his aircraft scarred yet operational. Ground crews observed patterns in the wear he reported, adjusting maintenance schedules to preempt failures before they escalated. The psychological dimension of strain proved subtler than the mechanical. Each mission carried the weight of cumulative knowledge, the understanding that a single misjudgment could overwhelm compromised systems. He resisted the temptation to push the engine in moments of frustration. Discipline required suppressing pride. When interceptors escaped because he refused to overheat the engine in pursuit, he accepted the limitation without resentment. Survival depended on recognizing the aircraft's boundaries and shaping tactics around them. As weeks passed, the machine's reputation shifted slightly. It remained flawed, but within his control it demonstrated resilience. The scars accumulated along its fuselage were balanced by consistent returns to base. The squadron's losses continued, a stark reminder that no amount of mechanical sympathy guaranteed safety. Yet in the tightening sky above contested territory, he proved that endurance and measured judgment could offset deficits in raw capability. The aircraft strained under combat load, but through calculated energy management and attentive awareness, it remained airborne, carving its path through increasingly lethal airspace without surrendering to its own imperfections. The mission that pushed both pilot and machine to their limit began without outward distinction. The briefing outlined another deep penetration escort, bombers scheduled across a heavily defended industrial corridor where anti-aircraft batteries overlapped in disciplined grids. Weather reports predicted thin cloud cover at altitude, offering partial concealment but little relief from interception. He listened with the same measured attention he had cultivated over weeks of flying the aging aircraft, noting fuel requirements, rendezvous timing, and projected climb profiles. Nothing in the plan suggested catastrophe, yet the weight of accumulated strain hung over the dispersal field as engines were primed before dawn. Takeoff under full combat load demanded patience he could scarcely afford. External tanks, ammunition belts, and the expectation of sustained altitude pressed the aircraft toward its limits even before reaching operational height. The engine temperature rose steadily during climb, hovering near thresholds he had learned to respect. He moderated ascent more than formation leaders preferred, accepting a slightly lower initial position to preserve cooling margin. By the time they crossed into hostile territory, the engine had settled into a narrow band of tolerable heat, fragile but stable. The first indication of trouble came not from the engine, but from the horizon. Dark specks formed against pale sky, resolving into interceptors approaching with coordinated intent. They did not dive recklessly. They positioned themselves above and to the flank, exploiting altitude advantage gained through interior lines of defense. The bomber formation tightened instinctively. Radio chatter sharpened, then dissolved into clipped acknowledgments as doctrine took over. He checked coolant temperature again. It was already elevated from the long climb. There would be little reserve for prolonged high-power maneuvers. The interceptors descended in calculated arcs, forcing escort fighters to climb and meet them or risk allowing them through. For a moment he held formation discipline, conserving throttle, waiting to see where pressure would concentrate. Then one of the enemy aircraft broke lower than expected, angling toward the bomber's vulnerable rear quadrant. Instinct demanded immediate response. He advanced the throttle beyond conservative setting he had maintained for weeks. The engine answered with a surge that felt both powerful and strained, vibration deepening through control column. He pulled into a steep climb to intercept, aware that the aircraft was never designed for repeated aggressive pitch at combat weight. Airspeed bled quickly. The coolant needle edged higher, entering the caution band he had promised himself to avoid. An enemy fighter crossed his nose at oblique angle. He banked hard to follow, feeling the uneven roll rate that had long characterized the airframe. The left wing responded more sluggishly than the right, a quirk born of structural fatigue and subtle imbalance. He compensated with rudder, forcing alignment while avoiding abrupt stick inputs that might induce stall. The first system warning manifested as a tremor in hydraulic response. Control surfaces lagged half a heartbeat behind command. He eased pressure, allowing airflow to stabilize across the wings before committing to another turn. Below, tracer fire arced upward in disciplined streams. The sky compressed into intersecting paths of metal and momentum. He resisted the urge to chase the interceptor into a vertical spiral that would have demanded sustained full throttle. Instead, he anticipated the enemy's exit vector and cut across it in a shallow climbing arc, conserving energy while narrowing distance. Gunfire erupted in short, measured bursts rather than continuous streams. He fired only when alignment stabilized, aware that recoil vibrations added stress to already burdened structures. One burst passed wide. Another struck near the interceptor's wing root, forcing it to break away. The immediate threat to the bombers eased, but the engagement intensified elsewhere. Additional enemy aircraft pressed from different angles, exploiting any escort drawn out of position. Then the engine temperature spiked abruptly. The needle surged toward redline, likely triggered by prolonged high manifold pressure during the climb. He throttled back instinctively, sacrificing acceleration at the worst possible moment. A pursuing interceptor seized the opportunity, diving toward him with visible intent. The aircraft shuddered as he initiated a defensive brake turn. Hydraulic pressure faltered again, flaps momentarily hesitant despite remaining retracted. Structural strain transmitted through the fuselage as a low-frequency vibration, more felt than heard. He understood the aircraft's stall tendencies intimately. Under heavy load, it favored an abrupt wing drop to the left if angle of attack increased too sharply. With the enemy closing, he deliberately avoided pulling to the limit. Instead, he rolled gently right, allowing gravity to assist in a descending turn that built airspeed without excessive throttle. The pursuing fighter overshot slightly, expecting a tighter brake. In that fraction of miscalculation, he reversed direction using coordinated rudder rather than brute stick force, keeping airflow attached just enough to prevent stall. Coolant temperature remained dangerously high. He opened radiator flaps incrementally despite increased drag, trusting that a brief reduction in speed was preferable to catastrophic engine seizure. The aircraft felt heavy, as though every rivet objected to further strain. yet it remained responsive within the narrow envelope he respected. Another interceptor attempted to climb above him. He refused the invitation to follow. Instead, he leveled momentarily, preserving what little thermal margin remained, then executed a shallow dive that regained speed without exceeding structural limits. Around him, the broader engagement unfolded in fragmented glimpses, smoke trails marking damaged aircraft, bombers holding formation despite flak bursts tearing through their ranks. The contest ceased to feel like a duel of marksmanship and became instead a negotiation with physics. Every maneuver carried consequence measured in heat, load factor, and fuel burn. He calculated constantly, remaining coolant tolerance, distance to friendly lines, the time required for engine temperature to subside if given partial relief. Gradually, the intensity shifted. Enemy fighters disengaged in pairs, unwilling to press too far from defensive cover. The bombers, though scarred, maintained course toward their targets. He eased throttle further, allowing airflow to cool the engine in steady increments. Vibrations diminished from urgent tremor to manageable hum. Hydraulic pressure stabilized as he avoided abrupt inputs. The aircraft had absorbed stresses beyond recommended margins, yet it had not surrendered. When he rejoined the formation's outer screen, there was no surge of triumph, only controlled breathing and a deliberate scan of instruments. The engagement had tested every weakness the machine possessed. It had also affirmed that understanding those weaknesses could transform limitation into strategy. He had not outperformed the enemy through speed or climb. He had endured through restraint, through measured risk shaped by intimate knowledge of how close the aircraft could approach failure without crossing into it. The return flight began not with relief, but with assessment. Once the bombers turned for home and the last interceptors faded into distance, the sky felt deceptively open, yet the aircraft beneath him carried a memory of every aggressive maneuver. Engine temperature had dropped from its most dangerous peak, but it remained higher than ideal. The vibration that once signaled imminent overheating had softened, though it had not disappeared entirely. He reduced throttle to a conservative cruise setting and trimmed carefully, testing control response with gentle inputs. The machine answered, slower than new airframes might have, but consistent enough to suggest it would endure, if treated with patience. Below, the scarred industrial corridor receded beneath a thin veil of haze. Anti-aircraft fire continued in sporadic bursts as the formation withdrew, shells reaching upward in diminishing arcs that fell short of effective range. He kept altitude steady rather than climbing further, unwilling to strain the engine again for marginal safety. Fuel calculations occupied part of his mind. The extended engagement had increased consumption, and radiator adjustments had added drag. He recalculated distance against remaining reserves, adjusting mixture slightly to conserve without risking rough combustion. Every decision carried the quiet knowledge that mechanical failure now would leave little margin for recovery. The cockpit smelled faintly of heated oil, a sharper note than usual. He scanned instruments repeatedly, comparing needle positions against memory rather than trusting a single glance. Hydraulic pressure held within acceptable limits, though lower than during outbound transit. He cycled the landing gear indicator briefly without deploying it, ensuring response remained intact. The system hesitated before stabilizing. That half-second delay lingered in his thoughts. Landing would demand precision. As friendly territory approached, radio traffic grew denser. Reports of damaged aircraft filtered through clipped transmissions, some missing panels, others trailing smoke. Not all voices answered when called. He avoided dwelling on absences. Instead, he focused on keeping the engine within a narrow cooling window. Descending too quickly risked thermal shock to already stressed components. He initiated a gradual descent in stages, allowing airflow to moderate temperature without abrupt change. The aircraft felt heavy, fatigued in ways metal expressed through subtle flex and muted resonance. Cloud cover thinned as the airfield came into view, a stretch of darkened earth carved into the landscape. Vehicles moved along its perimeter, and faint figures gathered near dispersal points. He imagined the ground crew scanning the horizon, counting silhouettes against expectation. The approach demanded configuration changes that would test weakened hydraulics. He reduced speed incrementally, mindful not to drop below safe margin where stall characteristics could reassert unpredictably under stress. At pattern altitude, He lowered the landing gear. The lever moved with familiar resistance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a dull mechanical sound reverberated through the fuselage as the gear began extending. The indicator lights flickered before stabilizing. He waited longer than usual before trusting their signal, banking gently to feel for asymmetric drag. The aircraft responded evenly, though with a faint tremor through the right side. He resisted the urge to cycle the system again. Additional movement could invite failure. Flaps deployed slowly, descending in measured increments as hydraulic pressure adapted to the demand. Wind crossed the strip at an oblique angle, light but persistent. Under ordinary circumstances, he might have corrected with a more assertive approach. Today he chose steadiness over precision. He aligned early, compensating gradually rather than abruptly. The descent felt elongated, each second amplifying awareness of the undercarriage's vulnerability. Engine power was reduced carefully, avoiding sudden idle that might cause uneven cooling. As wheels met earth, the contact transmitted a muted jolt rather than the sharp bounce he feared. The aircraft rolled forward, tires gripping uneven surface. He kept back pressure gentle, allowing weight to settle without overstressing weakened struts. Only once the aircraft slowed to taxi speed did he permit a deeper breath. Even then, he monitored gauges until engine shut down. Coolant temperature declined reluctantly. Oil pressure held steady before tapering off as the propeller wound down. Silence settled gradually, broken by ticking metal contracting in cooler air. Ground crew approached with expressions that combined scrutiny and relief. They examined the landing gear first, crouching near joints and hydraulic lines. One mechanic ran a hand along the fuselage where new stress lines had emerged in faint ripples beneath paint. He climbed down without ceremony. There was no exuberant celebration, only nods exchanged between men who understood how narrow the margin had been. Maintenance teams began cataloging damage immediately, checking rivets along wing roots, inspecting radiator housing for warping, draining fluid samples to detect contamination from overheating. The aircraft had endured stresses beyond recommended limits, yet it had returned intact. That fact alone altered its standing on the field. Commanders reviewed reports later that evening. The mission had succeeded at cost, but not disproportionately. In debriefing, he described engine behavior with precise detail: temperature thresholds, hydraulic lag, structural vibration during high load turns. His account carried neither bravado nor complaint. It was a technical narrative shaped by survival. Strategists listening recognized that such aircraft, though aging, could remain viable if flown within disciplined parameters. Deployment patterns were reconsidered subtly, pairing experienced pilots with temperamental airframes rather than distributing them indiscriminately. Among the squadron, perception shifted. The machine once regarded as liability now represented measured possibility. It was not transformed into a symbol of invincibility. Its limitations remained visible in patched metal and cautious maintenance schedules. But it had demonstrated that weakness did not equate to futility. Under informed handling, it contributed meaningfully to operational demands. For him, the experience clarified an understanding already forming. Combat did not always reward aggression or mechanical superiority. It favored those who recognized thresholds and respected them. He had felt the aircraft approach irreversible failure, and it steered it back through restraint rather than force. That lesson settled more deeply than any decoration might have. As dusk dimmed the airfield, mechanics continued quiet work under lamps. The aircraft rested on its landing gear, scarred yet serviceable. In its endurance lay a reminder that survival in war often belonged not to the strongest machine, but to the clearest judgment guiding it.